Welcome back. Michael Brooks on the Majority Report. Joining us now is Stephen Cook. He's a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. Steve, thanks so much for being on the Majority Report again, my friend.
It's always a pleasure. How are you?
I'm doing well. Very, very,
Good.
always just a sort of pleasure to be talking with you, even though we somehow maintain such a good vibe, even in the most horrible of topics.
I can't think of anything more terrible. But okay, yeah. We do maintain this good vibe despite everything going on around us.
Well, you know what? Let's start with we'll start with the most positive thing I think that we can kind of get out of the Middle East region right now, which is that Kurdish fighters have been running the tables on ISIS for the last couple of months. They've been taking back territory in Syria. They've been liberating towns, and you know, I'm not one to idolize anybody, but I've always kind of maintained that, look, if you need a side in this conflict, I cannot think of anyone other than the Syrian Kurds to have some real sort of genuine, sympathy and identity with, ideologically and as well as in terms of just sort of the literal, just kind of amazing physical courage of their fight. Can you kind of explain those victories and then maybe what happened? I mean, ISIS was freaking everybody out a couple years ago. I felt like almost a couple years ago, people were thinking way too much about ISIS, and now maybe people are thinking a little too little.
Well, we do tend to go in those cycles about it. Remember when Al-Qaeda ate American foreign policy? Starting in June 2014, ISIS ate American foreign policy. It was the only thing that anybody could think about. And, American officials would go, to Asia and talk about the fight against ISIS and enlisting support in the fight against ISIS. So you're absolutely right. But to your direct question, look, the Syrian Kurds, the fighting force that the United States has been working with, the People's Protection Units, known by its acronym YPG, was set up around the second half of 2011 by the Kurdistan Workers' Party, this Turkish terrorist organization. The United States recognizes it as a terrorist organization that had been waging war against Turkey since 1984. And the Turkish Kurds went to the Syrian Kurds and said, no good is going to come of this uprising that's happening in Syria. You're going to have to protect yourself. So let us help you set up this fighting force. And over time, those two groups have become inextricably linked. And the PKK has been in the battlefield since, as I said, 1984. And they've imparted a significant amount of advice and personnel to the YPG. And then, of course, you have American special forces that have been working with and coordinating with the YPG. As you said, what other ally would you want in the fight against ISIS in Syria? And I think U.S. Central Command and the Joint Special Operations Command feel precisely the same way and have devoted a significant amount of resources to this fight. Of course, the whole policy creates all kinds of contradictions for the United States because, of course, the Turks regard the YPG, the Syrian Kurdish forces, as just an extension of the PKK and therefore are terrorists, and see the United States as essentially enabling a terrorist state on Turkey's southern border.
So, and I will just note, we don't have to belabor it, but I know some people are jumping up and down now, and I'll say I share some of the ambivalence of the PKK. I mean, they've certainly engaged in campaigns that have targeted and hurt civilians. So I think on some level, that's a fair description for any group or individual who would harm civilians for an ideological end is engaging in terrorism. But I also do recognize the arguments for it, fulfilling a number of other very legitimate, very important political functions. So let me just sort of table that and acknowledge that in the audience. But that being said, I mean, okay, it also, though, reveals contradictions in Turkish policy. One contradiction being, was Turkey far too blasé at best, potentially collaborationist at worst with ISIS itself a couple years ago. And the second being, we've talked so many times, and at this point, I mean, we're just in the full transition. There's no debate anymore about Erdogan and his governance and what it represents. But in the phase of the sort of who is Erdogan, and there are these terrible things, but there's also these really progressive things happening that perhaps he's doing for cynical reasons, but he is doing them. They were opening up. He was the one negotiating with the PKK. He was the one actually making some small but concrete steps in the direction of Kurdish civil rights. So I guess we'll get to why Turkey feels betrayed by the United States, but the first sort of thing out of it for me is that, okay, well, what about Turkey's own ambivalent relationship with ISIS, number one? And then number two, what about its own kind of flip back in the last couple of years to such a nationalist posture with the Kurds that they're even, targeting, I mean, forget the PKK, they're targeting actually, Kurdish civil society and genuine democratic parties.
Right. It's a stunning irony that we've come to this point because only the Justice and Development Party, only the AKP, could have opened a negotiation with the PKK, could have spoken about easing restrictions on Kurdish language, expressions of Kurdish culture. Only that party could have done it based on its worldview. And that worldview was, let's ratchet down the emphasis on Turkishness that's central to Turkish nationalism. Let's relax those ideas and build up the idea that we're all a bunch of happy Muslims in this country that we call Turkey, and we can all be Turkish citizens. What happened, and it began happening really with the spring 2014 municipal elections, what Erdogan found was, although AKP mayors and others didn't lose any races, they did cede some votes to nationalist parties. And he has, and in the spring of 2014, he was looking down the barrel of a presidential election and, importantly, a general election in 2015. And Erdogan is, if anything, a shrewd, careful, and paranoid politician, as all good politicians are. And he made a decision to shift back and capture this kind of nationalist corner of the Turkish electorate. And the idea was that he would secure his place as president, secure a majority in the parliament, and people believed that he would then kind of move back to this negotiation. But of course, violence, the PKK started undertaking violence in the summer of 2015. The election in June 2015 didn't go as well as Erdogan wanted. He was trying to sabotage coalition government talks, and we were often running into a hot war in 2015. The rerun of the elections produced the result that he wanted, but of course, too much blood had been spilled at that point for Erdogan to offer a hand back for negotiations. So that's where we are. The PKK, there's some indication that the PKK, having been battered terribly in this fight with the Turks over the course of the last couple of years, are willing to restart negotiations. We'll see where that goes. But that's why you see this kind of stridently nationalist tone coming out of Ankara. And as you said, it's not just going after the PKK. The leadership of the predominantly Kurdish party, legal party in Turkey, are sitting in jail. So
and this is just totally like they're social democrats. I mean, I've covered them on my show, and I mean, we actually were making the case, Jean Bajalan and I, that not only is this sort of like a fully paid up, open democratic party, some of the models that they even have for kind of broad social democracy and also sort of group identity and rights, it's almost like a world-class synthesis in some ways. So, I mean, these guys that are being oppressed, there's no violence, there's no ambiguity about where they are on the map.
Right. They are social democrats. There's been some conjecture that the leadership does have links to the PKK. I would think that they would, if only because these are Turkish Kurds, and this is part of the Turkish-Kurdish political spectrum, and that they would be in communication in communication with these groups. But
Right.
it is this kind of strident Turkish nationalism that overtook Turkish policy when it came to Syria. And when President Obama went to the Turks and said, hey, we really need your help on the Islamic State, the Turks said, actually, we have other priorities, and that's snuffing out Kurdish nationalism, because the last thing we want to see is this Kurdish, autonomous, independent, whatever you want to call it, statelet entity, whatever, on Turkey's southern border carved out of northern Syria. And so there was this kind of turning a blind eye to extremist groups like ISIS that were going to fight.
Was it a
the Kurds.
blind eye, or was it, as some people suggest, even a little bit more supportive than just a blind eye?
Well, there was an
versus-
evolution.
Yeah.
There was an evolution of Turkish policy here. The Turks initially were willing to, absent an American intervention in Syria, were willing to allow people to use their territory, extremists to use their territory to attack the Assad regime.
Mm-hmm.
When it came to the Kurds, when it came to Kobani and the ISIS onslaught on Kobani, the Turks decided not to act because essentially ISIS was doing its bidding. There is some evidence, the Turkish newspaper Cumhuriyet, which is a left nationalist, alleged keeper of the Ataturkist flame, had allegedly uncovered evidence that the Turks were actually shipping weapons that were coming to the hands of ISIS. The journalist and editor who did those stories ended up in jail for this. Mm-hmm. So there is some circumstantial evidence that they were directly coordinating. There's no doubt, of course, that the Turks were coordinating with Al-Qaeda affiliates in
Right.
Syria. So it's been a ugly, dirty, terrible situation, and it's gotten the Turks all caught up in the Syrian civil war, and it's really radicalized Turkish politics.
Is there any, I mean, and now it comes to this piece that you wrote recently in Politico, why Turkey feels burned by Trump, or I guess it was, a couple weeks ago in late November. Yeah. Was it because, and we were speculating in the office before this conversation, that Erdogan just feels upset that Trump wasn't more supportive of him unleashing his bodyguards to beat up peaceful protesters in D.C.? What is the
rumble on Sheridan Circle?
Oh my God! I mean,
like everybody else in the Middle East, the Turkish government, people who were supportive of the Turkish government were really looking forward to President Trump's tenure. They saw Obama as ambivalent about them, and they really believed that Obama was a creature of the American establishment, bizarrely, and that Trump, having campaigned against the establishment, would side with Turkey, and that Turkey's real problem was in the kind of commentary and the people around Obama from the establishment who disliked Turkey, which was, of course, a complete opposite. The American foreign policy establishment has for years shielded Turkey, bent over backwards to prevent an Armenian genocide resolution, all these kinds of things.
Right.
And then following these expectations, there was the belief that, one, Trump would facilitate the extradition of Fethullah Gulen, who the Turkish government accuses of masterminding the failed coup in 2016, believed that the Trump administration would stop coordinating and arming the Syrian Kurds, and believed that they would put an end to the trial of Reza Zarrab, this Turkish-Iranian businessman who's now turned state's evidence and is spilling all the beans about Turkey's role in busting sanctions on Iran. Mm-hmm. So none of those things have come to pass. The trials continued. Fethullah Gulen's extradition process is in the courts, and President Trump and Vice President Pence has said to the Turks, hey, we're going to continue working with the Syrian Kurds. So the Turks are in a rage over all of these issues, and they're in a rage over the commentary about Turkey in the United States and the West more broadly.
Hi, folks. Sam Seder here. We still need your help on our Patreon page. YouTube ads have come back, but not nearly as much as we had before. So if you can help us out, any little bit helps. head over to our Patreon page right at this URL, and you'll help us keep helping you by making videos